Eli Thompson never imagined his new start would come with the sound of a chainsaw. But there it was, the aftermath clear as day splinters, where dreams once perched, and a neighbor in pressed khakis claiming it was all for safety and the sake of his wife's flowers. 3 days before the treehouse had stood proud and steady in the Thompson backyard, nestled between the heavy limbs of a 100-year-old elm. Milo had named it Sky Cabin. He'd painted the sign himself in wobbly blue letters. There were 2 chairs inside a flashlight mounted to the wall, and a small army surplus radio Ray had dusted off for nostalgia. Eli remembered how Milo's face lit up when Ray showed him how to fasten the trap door, how they'd both laughed when they miscut a beam and had to start over. That little space in the sky had been their triumph. Eli's healing Ray's second wind, and Milo's fortress all in one. Now, gone. The early morning sun did little to warm the chill crawling up Eli's spine. He stood barefoot in the grass, coffee untouched in his hand. A few feet away, the ancient elm wore wounds of deep, jagged cuts, surgical and deliberate. It wasn't just the treehouse that had been butchered, it was the spirit behind it. "Unsafe," said Derek Langston, leaning casually against his fence. "Didn't get a permit, did you? You know something like that could cave in on a child." His voice was polished, rehearsed. Eli looked at the man's silver hair, the neatly trimmed beard, the smug tilt of his mouth. He'd heard about Langston from a neighbor, the type who measured his lawn with a ruler, filed HOA complaints for barking dogs, and always seemed to just be stepping out whenever someone put up decorations that didn't match the block's aesthetic. Eli didn't respond. He couldn't. Not without shaking. The only thing louder than Langston's excuses was the silence in Eli's chest, the way his heart felt pressed against his ribs, aching for the little boy still asleep upstairs, who'd fallen asleep whispering dreams of summer nights in the treehouse. Ray hadn't said much either. When he stepped out a few minutes later, eyes hard, jaw tight, he only asked one thing: was it him? Eli nodded once. Ray turned, walked back into the house. No threats, no shouting. Just that look like something inside him had died and wasn't coming back. Milo joined them at breakfast an hour later, chipper at first, until he noticed the empty view out the kitchen window. "Where's Sky Cabin?" he asked. Eli didn't lie. "It's gone, bud. Someone took it down." Milo blinked slowly. Why? It blocked someone's flowers. The boy didn't cry. He didn't shout. He just looked at his cereal and stopped eating. That said everything. The rest of the day dragged. Eli called no one, filed no report. What would he say? The man admitted it claimed it was a public safety concern. No permit, no HOA approval. And in a place like Marlow, Glen paperwork meant power. Langston had both. But as the sun dipped behind the elm's battered limbs, Eli stepped into his garage. He stared at the bare pegboard wall, a few nails still holding Ray's old tools, some coated in dust, others polished from recent use. His hand brushed against a crowbar, the cool steel grounding him in the decision already forming in his gut. He wouldn't let it end like this. Not because of one man's arrogance. Not when something that mattered, really mattered, had been taken so casually. The treehouse was never about wood or nails or even the tree. It was about building something bigger than themselves. And if Derek Langston thought silence was agreement, he was about to find out what a father's quiet fury looked like. Eli left the garage door open and walked back into the house. He kissed Milo goodnight, told Ray to rest. Then he grabbed his keys and drove east, where a certain someone owed him a favor. Tomorrow wouldn't fix what was lost, but it would begin the reckoning. Eli didn't scream. He didn't raise hell or call the cops. He just got in his truck before the anger could speak for him and drove east. 2 hours down winding state roads, through patches of forgotten woods, and past gas stations with hand-painted ice cream signs. Somewhere outside Riverton, he stopped in front of a bait shop that didn't have a name, just an old blue door with peeling paint and a paper sign in the window that read, "Open." He hadn't spoken to Seth in years. They were never friends, not exactly. But once upon a time, Seth had needed a man with a clean name to co-sign for a transmission shop loan. Eli had stepped up, no questions asked. Seth paid it back in cash in full and disappeared after that. Eli wasn't here to collect on that debt, but he knew Seth would understand the kind of thing you didn't write down. "I need something potent," Eli said after explaining just enough to make Seth lean back and whistle low through his teeth. "Retaliation or symbolism?" Seth asked. "Both." He left with 3 black bags and 1 roll of heavy-duty industrial wrap contractor grade. Eli paid in cash. No receipts. By nightfall, he was back in Marlow Glen. The house was dark. Milo had gone to bed early, probably still morning sky cabin in his own quiet way. Ray sat on the porch smoking a cigarette, like it was a prayer, watching nothing, saying less. Eli nodded to him, then disappeared into the garage. He prepped slowly, methodically. Gloves. Zip ties. The bags weren't illegal, not technically, but they were heavy, and they reeked fish emulsion thick with decay. Eli opened one and nearly gagged. The scent hit him like a fist, sour, rotting primal. Perfect. He waited until well after midnight. The street had gone silent. Even the frogs had quieted. The only sound was the whisper of trees rustling in the breeze and the slow, determined thump of Eli's boots across the lawn. Langston's porch sat proud and pristine, all white columns and spotless railings. Eli crouched underneath, rolling out the industrial wrap along the beams and nailing it tight with a silence that came from years of working around Milo's bedtime. Then he slid a blade through the top of the plastic and poured in the sludge. Gallons of it. It pooled and soaked thick and sticky like liquid death. He could feel the stench clinging to his clothes already. He hoped it'd soak into the wood, into the foundation, that Langston would never escape it. But that wasn't all. Eli reached into his satchel and pulled out the sign. Same size as Milo's original. Same paint. Same crooked handwriting. Except this one said, "We see everything." He hammered it into the front lawn right under Langston's window, then vanished back across the lawn heart, pounding like a war drum. He didn't sleep, just sat in the dark living room with a cup of water he never drank, waiting for the sun. At 7:32 a.m., Langston opened his front door. Eli watched from his porch, legs crossed, expression calm. Langston looked down, puzzled at first. Then his nose twitched. He gagged, staggered back like he'd been punched. "Mary," he bellowed. She appeared in a pink robe, her yappy dog barking from under one arm. One sniff, and she shrieked, stumbling into the bushes. Langston began shouting into his phone. First his landscaper, then someone from the HOA. A cleaning service showed up the next day. Workers in hazmat suits hauled equipment out of a white van and disappeared beneath the porch. Eli didn't say a word, just waved politely from his steps when one of them passed. By the 3rd day, the smell hadn't faded. It had deepened, festered. Langston's porch boards were being ripped out. His contractor argued with him in the yard. Something about chemical corrosion and replacing the insulation under the house. Ray watched it all unfold, puffing quietly on his cigarette. "You did it, didn't you?" he asked one night, not looking at Eli. "I didn't hurt anyone. That's not what I asked." Eli stayed silent. Ray sighed. "You think you're protecting Milo, but what you're doing, it sticks. The hate, the fear, the silence. It sticks to boys like smoke in their lungs. You keep going down this road, he'll grow up coughing on it." Eli wanted to argue, but he couldn't. So he nodded, got up, and walked inside. He was halfway through his second cup of coffee the next morning when 2 officers knocked on his door. One in uniform, one in a Navy windbreaker. Mr. Thompson, the plainclothes one, said, "We'd like to ask you a few questions about an incident involving your neighbor." Eli opened the door wide and stepped aside. "Come in." The night after the officers came, Eli stayed awake sitting at the kitchen table long after Ray had gone to bed. Milo, too, had barely spoken all evening, just nodded when Eli said goodnight and disappeared up the stairs without another word. The boy didn't even glance at the backyard, as if pretending the treehouse had never existed would make the ache sting less. That was what made Eli certain this wasn't just about petty revenge anymore. It was about making sure no one could casually erase what mattered again. He waited until 2 a.m., when Marlowe Glen went black and silent. Not even a dog barked. Eli slipped on his gloves and grabbed the bag from the garage. Inside was a 5-gallon container of thick, soupy fish emulsion liquid fertilizer meant for soil, but reeking of decay and coastal rot. Alongside it was the industrial plastic wrap nail gun and the hand-painted sign he'd made with a trembling brush. "We see everything." The words had taken longer to write than he'd admit. Not because he couldn't paint, but because part of him felt guilty. The same part that still saw Milo's face when he discovered the treehouse in ruins, the way his shoulders sagged and his eyes lost their usual spark. Eli crossed the yard like a shadow crouching behind the wooden fence that separated his house from Langston's. The air was cool, but still heavy with the scent of damp grass and gasoline from someone's mower left out too long. He scaled the side quietly, staying low, slipping behind a boxwood hedge until he reached the porch. Langston's porch was pristine, whitewashed and spotless, like it had been pressure washed every weekend since the house was built. But underneath it was hollow, a crawl space just high enough for Eli to work in. He rolled out the plastic with steady hands, nailing it to the underside of the floorboards, so tight it could hold soup. Then, careful not to spill a drop, he slit the top open and poured in the fish emulsion. It glugged thickly, the smell hitting immediately. It was worse than Eli remembered, something between dead seals and burnt rubber. A chemical rot that clung to every fiber of his clothes. He gagged, once turned his face to breathe, then kept going. He emptied the entire container. By the time he finished sealing it, the smell was already rising. The plastic would trap it for a bit, but the heat of morning would start to draw it out through the wood. And once it got into the grain, into the siding, it would become a permanent guest. He stood in Langston's manicured front yard, wiped sweat from his brow, and drove the sign into the soil just beneath the bay window. He didn't rush this part. Each strike of the hammer felt like a bell toll a declaration. When he stepped back and looked at it, those 4 crooked words in Milo's favorite color, it felt right. Just enough. We see everything. He didn't run when he left. Just walked home, peeled off his gloves in the garage, stripped out of his clothes, and shoved them into a black trash bag. He left them in the outside bin covered in baking soda, and finally finally went to sleep. Morning came with chaos. Eli was already on his second coffee when he saw Langston stumble out the door, confused and squinting at the sign, like it might disappear if he blinked hard enough. Then came the smell. Langston staggered back like someone punched him in the chest. He looked around wildly, waving his arms like he could swat away the stench. "Mary!" He yelled, voice shrill and panicked. Mary emerged seconds later dressed in a flowing nightgown, clutching her dog like a shield. She took one breath and doubled over, gagging, rushing back inside. Langston started dialing furiously, first on his phone, then on a landline he dragged out onto the porch. Eli didn't hear the words, but he saw the desperation, the red face, the wild pacing, the frantic gestures toward the porch. By that afternoon, a team of cleaners arrived in a white van. They wore heavy gloves and filtered masks. Eli watched them crawl under the porch, then retreat minutes later, shaking their heads. The next morning, contractors were there with crowbars tearing up the boards. Langston stood to the side, ranting. One of the workers pointed at something under the porch, made a comment, and Langston turned even redder. The neighborhood started to notice. Whispers spread. Someone from 2 doors down mentioned the smell on Facebook. Another neighbor walked past and wrinkled their nose. Langston tried to keep control, yelling at the contractors, snapping at Mary, but the image was slipping. And still, the sign remained, untouched, right where Eli had left it. That night, Ray joined him on the back steps. "You left a mark," he said quietly. Eli didn't look at him. He earned it. Ray took a long drag of his cigarette, exhaled. "So did we. You think this ends it?" Eli finally turned. "No, but it's a start." By the 4th morning, the stench was no longer just a nuisance, it was a presence. It clung to the air like humidity, thick and aggressive. Even a breeze couldn't carry it far enough. The porch boards had started to curl. Mary Langston had stopped going outside altogether. Her precious dog had developed a cough. And Derek, he was unraveling. Eli watched from his porch mug in hand, face unreadable. At 7:00 a.m., the contractor Eli had seen the day before pulled up again, this time with a younger guy in tow. The younger one wore a grimace from the moment he stepped out of the truck. "Holy hell," he muttered, pinching his nose. Derek pointed, gesturing rapidly, and they both disappeared beneath the porch. 5 minutes later, they crawled out fast. Derek followed, still talking, but the younger guy was shaking his head. "It's in the joists," Eli heard him say, "and I don't know what the hell it is, but it's soaked in. I'd replace the whole damn deck if I were you." Derek's jaw clenched. "Then replace it." "Not my problem," the contractor replied. "You'll need environmental cleanup, maybe mold treatment too. This isn't a DIY. That word started to float through the neighborhood like wildfire. Environmental. It was followed by others, toxic hazard hazmat. Eli didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The next person to walk past Langston's house was Mrs. Coleman, who lived 4 doors down. She wrinkled her nose, then raised her phone for a picture. Later, that photo landed in the neighborhood Facebook group, captioned simply, "Anyone else smell that?" By lunchtime, 3 more neighbors had posted. Someone joked about calling the CDC. Someone else said they saw a dead squirrel under Langston's hedge. Even the mailman walked faster past the house. It wasn't just the smell anymore. It was the story building around it. One Derek Langston couldn't control. That's when Eli knew it wouldn't be long before Langston tried something big. The man didn't know how to lose quietly. And right on cue, the law came knocking. 2 days after the porch incident, Eli opened the door to 2 men in plain clothing. One showed a badge, the other held a photo. Mr. Thompson, the one with the badge, asked, "That's me. We'd like to ask you a few questions regarding a vandalism complaint made by your neighbor, Mr. Langston." Eli didn't blink. "Come on in." They stepped into the kitchen, taking their time. The younger officer looked around slowly, eyes catching on the framed photo of Milo and Ray from the day they finished the original Treehouse. The one where they were both grinning sweaty and proud hands, covered in blue and red paint. "This is your son?" he asked. "Yes." He make this sign. He handed over a printed photo. Milo's handwriting clear as day on a plank of wood. "We see everything." Eli's jaw tightened, but he didn't answer right away. "I helped him make the original," he finally said. "It was for the Treehouse. Did you happen to recreate a version of it recently?" Eli held his ground. "No." The officer raised a brow. "Your neighbor claims you placed it on his lawn after intentionally contaminating the structure of his home." Eli said nothing. "Anything you'd like to say in response? I think Langston's real upset about some noise lately," Eli replied calmly. "A lot of neighborhood kids out playing again. Might be getting to him." The officers exchanged a glance. "Well," the older one said, sliding the photo back into his folder, "he's filed a report. We're not charging anyone right now, but we're letting you know if anything else happens. You'll be under a microscope." Eli nodded. Understood. They left without further comment. That evening, Ray leaned against the doorway, arms folded. "He's trying to flip the narrative," Ray said. "I know. And if you keep this up, he'll succeed." Eli looked at him. "I haven't touched him." Ray raised an eyebrow. "Doesn't mean you're clean." Eli sighed and stepped out onto the porch. The breeze was cooler now, but still carried a trace of that fishy decay. It hadn't gone away. Not yet. Langston had retaliated the only way he knew how, by weaponizing the rules, dragging in the authorities, and making himself the victim. But Eli wasn't shaken. He expected this. Knew it was only a matter of time before Langston flexed the only muscles he had left. The difference now, the neighborhood was watching, and for the first time, they weren't looking at Langston with deference or fear. They were looking at him with disgust. It was early afternoon when they returned. 2 patrol cars this time. One uniformed officer knocked on the front door, while the other waited by the cruiser. Eli didn't flinch, he'd half expected it. He opened the door slowly, kept his face calm, neutral. "Mr. Thompson," the officer asked. "That's me. We have a few follow-up questions about the ongoing situation with your neighbor, Mr. Langston." Eli stepped aside. "You want to come in?" The officer looked over his shoulder, then nodded. "Just a few minutes, sir." Eli led him into the kitchen, gesturing toward the table. The officer sat and pulled out a small notepad, flipping it open with deliberate care. He was older than the pair from earlier, graying at the temples' eyes, sharp like a man who'd seen too many late-night calls and domestic squabbles to be easily impressed. "We understand from Mr. Langston that you've been involved in what he's calling a campaign of targeted harassment," the officer began. "Specifically a sign placed on his lawn and a substance poured beneath his porch." Eli didn't blink. "He say what kind of substance? He claims it's a hazardous chemical, something used to damage the structure of his home. That's a hell of an accusation." The officer slid a printed photo across the table. Same sign, same crooked letters. "We see everything." He says this was meant as intimidation. Eli picked up the photo, turned it once, then set it down. "My son made the original for his treehouse. before Langston destroyed it. So he made this one too. No, Eli said firmly. We haven't made another one since. That one was painted weeks ago, and it stayed in our backyard until the treehouse was taken down. The officer studied him for a long moment. Your neighbor is alleging vandalism, that someone trespassed and deliberately contaminated his property. Eli leaned back in his chair. You have any evidence of that? We're not pressing charges at this time, just gathering information, but I'd advise you to keep things civil, Mr. Thompson. Retaliation can spiral. Eli nodded once. Noted. When the officer finally left, Eli locked the door behind him and stood for a moment, hands resting on the doorknob, like it might keep the tension from moving up his arms. His heart wasn't racing. Not exactly. But it had that tightness to it, like something caged was pacing inside. Ray was waiting in the hallway. You think you're in the clear? He asked. Eli didn't answer. You're not, Ray said. Not even close. I didn't do anything illegal. That's not the point. Eli crossed into the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and downed half of it before replying. Then, what is? Ray stepped into the room, eyes shadowed with something more than worry. It's Milo. Eli froze. You think he doesn't know? Think he doesn't feel it? The tension, the silence, the way you pace like you're ready to snap every time someone mentions that man's name. Eli's shoulders tensed. I'm handling it. No, you're stewing in it, Ray shot back. And he sees it. Kids always do. They breathe it in like secondhand smoke. Eli looked at the table. You expect me to just let it go? No. Ray said, his voice softer now. I expect you to think about what this is doing to him. To you. Ray stepped closer, his voice low and even. This kind of anger clings to boys, Eli. You're turning into the kind of man you used to loathe. The kind that thinks silence is strength. That vengeance is justice. Eli clenched his jaw. You know what I remember most about my own father, Ray said. The way he came home, mad. Not loud. Just heavy. Like the whole house had to hold its breath until he left again. I swore I'd never be like him. I thought I kept my promise. But I look at you now, and I see it all coming back. Eli's breath caught. Ray turned toward the back door. You want to protect Milo, fine. Start by showing him that being strong doesn't mean being consumed. The door closed quietly behind him. Eli sat down alone in the kitchen, the officer's photo still sitting on the table. The image of the sign Milo's handwriting twisted into a message of threat, stared back at him like a mirror. Maybe it wasn't just Langston unraveling. Maybe it was him too. And as much as he hated to admit it, Ray was right. Something about the treehouse's destruction had cracked a part of him he thought was buried deep. Not because of what was taken, but because of what it had meant for Milo, for Ray, for all three of them. And he'd let that pain shape his every move since. He rubbed his face with both hands, exhaled slowly. Something had to change. Before the boy upstairs inherited more than just a memory. The sound of a chainsaw wasn't something you forgot, not when you'd heard it tear down something sacred. So when Eli heard it again just after dawn, he jolted upright from his seat on the porch. He thought maybe he was imagining it, a phantom noise born of memory and guilt. But 10 minutes later, the phone rang. It was June Jefferson from 2 houses down. She didn't ask for anything, didn't even say hello. Just one trembling sentence. He did it to us too. Eli was already halfway down the street when he saw the wreckage. The Jeffersons' backyard had always been modest. Just a small lawn with a wooden A-frame swing, set weathered but solid. Their grandkids used it every weekend, tiny legs pumping high, as they squealed with laughter. Now it lay in pieces, hacked apart with brutal precision. The slide was split down the center, one swing twisted on the ground, the other gone completely. Splinters were everywhere. It was no accident. June stood in the driveway, her hand pressed to her mouth. Beside her, Walter Jefferson was on the phone, pacing like a man trying to hold his fury inside a cracking shell. "He said it was an eyesore," June whispered. "Said we didn't ask permission. That it cluttered the view." Eli's stomach turned. Permission. That same word Langston had thrown at him, like this man believed he was the gatekeeper of their street. "It wasn't just us," Walter said when he hung up. "You were just the first." "What do you mean?" Eli asked. Walter nodded toward the street. "Ask around. He's been doing this for years." That's exactly what Eli did. He spent the next 2 days knocking on doors. At first, people were hesitant, guarded, like they weren't sure what side he was on. But then he'd mention the treehouse, the swing set, and the floodgates would open. Mrs. Hughes across the street had been fined twice by the HOA for her mailbox being too whimsical. The design a small painted cottage her late husband made. A week after it was installed, Langston had filed a formal complaint. The Clarks, a young couple on the corner, were warned about illegal gatherings because they hosted backyard barbecues with music, nothing louder than a radio. A single mom named Vanessa had been cited 3 times for lawn violations. When she fought the fines, she found out each complaint came from the same address, 141 Maple Lane, Langston's. The stories varied, but the pattern was unmistakable. Every small joy, swings, decorations, music, even kids playing too loudly had been targeted, and always under the pretense of neighborhood standards, safety concerns, or aesthetics. Langston had a way of hiding behind the rules, and no one had ever pushed back. Until now. Eli called for a meeting. Just a handful of them at first, those directly affected. They met in his backyard, sitting on folding chairs where the treehouse had once stood. Milo watched quietly from the kitchen window, while Ray leaned in the doorway, listening without interrupting. Eli didn't try to rally them with speeches. He just laid it out. "He's not just angry," Eli said. "He's controlling. And he's been getting away with it because we all thought we were alone." Heads nodded. June dabbed at her eyes. Vanessa clenched her jaw. "I'm not asking anyone to fight dirty," Eli continued. "But we don't have to stay quiet anymore. We can stand together." The meeting ended with quiet resolve. No one yelled. No one threatened violence. But there was a shift, subtle but real. A spark. And over the next few days, it grew. Sidewalks bloomed with chalk drawings. Kids played tag until dusk. The Jeffersons hung solar lights along their fence, and their grandkids returned laughing louder than ever. Eli installed a new ladder onto the rebuilt treehouse. This time, it had a brighter paint job, thicker supports, and a solar-powered spotlight that lit up the yard the moment anyone approached it after dark. Langston called code enforcement 3 times that week. Nothing stuck. He stormed up and down the street, snapping photos, pointing at minor things, like a plastic flamingo in someone's yard, or a mailbox that tilted slightly left. But now, no one was listening. Even the HOA rep had stopped returning his calls. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the neighborhood kids played soccer in a neighbor's driveway, Langston stood in his yard, arms crossed, face red, muttering to himself. He looked not like a man in charge, but one desperately trying to hold on to the illusion. Eli watched him from the treehouse deck, Milo beside him, legs swinging. "Is he mad again?" Milo asked. "Probably," Eli said. Milo was quiet for a beat, then said, "I like it better this way." Eli smiled but didn't say anything, because now it wasn't just him standing up. It was all of them. It started with sidewalk chalk. One afternoon, Milo and the Jeffersons' grandkids spent an hour drawing a massive winding dragon down the sidewalk in front of their houses. Bright reds, greens, even a trail of gold coins beneath its tail. No one told them to do it. They just did. June Jefferson stepped outside with lemonade and smiled so wide it softened the creases in her face. That smile spread faster than the dragon. By the end of the week, every driveway on the block had become a canvas. There were hopscotch patterns, rainbows, silly faces, and stars. Someone even scrawled a crooked quote next to the mailbox at 1-37 Maple Lane Joy as an act of resistance. It was signed Eli T., though Eli never claimed it. At first, Langston tried to fight it the only way he knew how: complaints. One by one, he called code enforcement. The HOA even left a printed list of violations in the community mailbox. But nothing happened. The rules didn't ban chalk. And now that he'd burned so many bridges, the enforcers weren't rushing to back him up. Next came the backyard dinners. It began as a once-a-week thing. The Clarks grilled burgers, passed out paper plates, and invited everyone to bring something. Then the Jeffersons joined in stringing lights across their back fence, setting out card tables. Before long, it was every Saturday evening, neighbors eating laughing music, floating gently from Bluetooth speakers, tucked near garden beds. Langston, of course, watched from behind his window blinds. Sometimes he paced on his porch phone in hand. Other times he simply stood there silent and seething as the smell of barbecue drifted through his hedges. Ray started showing up too. Not just to eat, but to sit and listen. He didn't say much, but when he did, it was worth hearing. "Funny," he said once, swirling a beer in his hand. All it took to beat one man was a bunch of people remembering what it means to live like neighbors again. Eli didn't rebuild the treehouse right away. He waited, wanted to be sure this change was real, that it wasn't just another flare of hope waiting to be extinguished. But after the third dinner, he caught Milo sitting in the backyard on a folded towel, staring up at the scarred branches of the elm. That night, he found Ray on the porch. "I want to rebuild it," Eli said. Ray nodded. "Then let's make it better." And they did. The new treehouse was wider, stronger, and brighter than the original. They used reclaimed wood from a local yard sale, added railings with solar lights, and even installed a slide from an old playground set. Milo picked the color sky blue with red trim and helped with every brushstroke. But Eli's favorite feature wasn't the slide or the paint. It was the motion-activated spotlight he rigged beneath the entry ladder. He wired it to an old solar panel and set the sensitivity high. Anyone approaching the treehouse at night would be caught in a cone of light that lit the backyard like a stage. Milo called it the lighthouse beam. Eli just smiled. When it was done, the whole neighborhood came to see it. Not a grand event, just a slow stream of people stopping by after dinner, walking through the yard, congratulating Milo, clapping Ray on the back. The Jefferson kids climbed up first, shouting with glee. Even the Clarks brought cupcakes. Eli stood to the side, arms crossed, heart swelling. He watched Langston's porch light flick on then off. A few minutes later, the blinds shifted. He was watching. Of course he was, but this time he was the one alone. Later that night, after everyone had gone home, Eli sat on the deck of the new treehouse with Milo. They passed a flashlight back and forth, taking turns reading from a book. When they finished, Milo curled up beside him, his voice quiet. It feels safe now. Eli blinked slowly. Yeah, it does. Then from across the yard, a flicker of movement. A shadow crept through Langston's side hedge, slinking toward the tree line. Eli held his breath. The spotlight hadn't triggered it, only caught movement within a certain range. Whoever it was, they were staying low, trying to avoid detection. Milo stirred, sensing the tension. Go inside, Bud, Eli whispered. Now. Milo obeyed without question. Eli climbed down, heart pounding, and moved quickly toward the shadow, staying on the far side of the treehouse. As he rounded the trunk, he caught sight of the figure dark clothes, bolt cutters in hand, edging toward the base of the rope ladder. Langston. Eli didn't yell. He didn't need to. The second Langston saw him, bat in hand, he froze. Not like a man ready to fight, but like a child caught where he shouldn't be. What the hell are you doing? Eli's voice was low, almost calm. Langston opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. You step one more foot, Eli said, and I call the cops. Langston wavered, then slowly backed away, dropped the bolt cutters in the grass, and disappeared into the night without another word. The spotlight never needed to turn on. Eli stood there in the dark, bat still in hand, thinking he's not in control anymore. And maybe, for the first time in years, he knows it. The bolt cutters gleamed in the moonlight. Langston was careful this time. No lights, no noise, dressed in all black, like he was headed to a burglary instead of a vendetta. He'd parked his car around the block, walked through someone else's yard, then crawled through the narrow alley that led to Eli's backyard. He must have studied the spotlight's sensor range, noticed the blind spot near the elm's far edge. He thought he was clever, but Eli had expected this. He hadn't been sleeping much. Something about the way Langston watched from his porch, the twitch in his jaw, the way his gaze always found the treehouse, Eli knew the man wasn't done. There was a fever in his eyes, the kind that didn't fade with warnings or fines. So when Eli heard the faint clink of metal against wood at 2:17 a.m., he didn't hesitate. He grabbed the aluminum bat leaning against the wall by the back door and moved like a shadow, barefoot and silent. He rounded the back of the house, just in time to see Langston crouching at the base of the new ladder. The bolt cutters were open, poised at the lowest rung. His hands trembled, whether from rage or nerves, Eli couldn't tell. But Langston didn't expect to be caught. What the hell are you doing? Eli's voice broke the silence like glass. Langston jumped, spun around. The bolt cutters slipped from his hands and landed in the grass with a dull thud. I was just what Eli took a step forward, bat grip tight, knuckles white. Trying to finish the job you started, Langston straightened, tried to recover some of that arrogance he always wore like cologne. That thing's a hazard, he said, voice shaking. Built without inspection. It's a code violation. You don't get to decide what my son plays on. It's dangerous, Langston snapped. It's too tall. It lights up at night and shines into my house. Eli stepped closer, eyes locked. You come into my yard again, I won't be calling the HOA. I'll be calling the cops. You understand? Langston's mouth opened like he had more to say, but nothing came out. Just the sound of his breathing, fast and uneven. Then he turned and walked away quickly, stumbling once as he tripped over the hedge. Eli didn't sleep the rest of the night. He sat at the kitchen table with the bat across his lap, watching the shadows outside stretch and shrink with the rising sun. He thought maybe, just maybe, that would be the end of it. He was wrong. 2 days later, a sheriff's deputy knocked on the door. This one wasn't friendly. You, Eli Thompson. Yeah. You've been served. The papers were heavy in his hands. 4 pages stapled and stamped with urgency. A temporary restraining order, filed by Derek Langston, citing harassment, targeted intimidation, and aggressive behavior during a late-night altercation. Attached were photos printed grainy stills, of the spotlight a shot of the treehouse, and an image of Langston's arm with a faint red mark. He's saying you threatened him with a weapon. The deputy explained expression unreadable, claimed he was there to photograph a code violation when you attacked him with a bat. Eli's mouth opened, then closed. Milo watched from the stairs wide-eyed. Ray stepped into the hallway. He's lying. I'm sure he is, the deputy said. But for now, the judge granted a temporary order. You're not to go within 100 feet of his property. That includes verbal or visual contact. And my son's treehouse. The deputy exhaled, clearly uncomfortable. If it's within the restricted range, it'll need to stay unused until the hearing. I'm sorry. Ray's face darkened, but he said nothing. Eli just nodded. Got it. That night, Eli had to tell Milo he couldn't play in the treehouse anymore. Not until the court sorted things out. The boy stared at him confused. But we just built it. I know. I didn't even get to sleep up there yet. I'm sorry, buddy. Milo didn't cry. He just sat down at the kitchen table and stared at his untouched cereal. I don't get it. Why does he hate us so much? Eli didn't answer, because honestly, he didn't know anymore. Later, after Milo went to bed, Ray poured 2 beers and joined Eli on the back steps. He's using your anger against you, Ray said. Every time you push back, he gets to play the victim. Eli nodded slowly. So what do I do? Ray took a long sip. You bleed him slow, the same way he's been bleeding this neighborhood for years. Paperwork, permits, the stuff that cuts deep but never looks like violence. Eli didn't say anything. He just stared at the treehouse in the moonlight, empty and silent, its spotlight now permanently off. Not because he'd done something wrong, but because he'd let Langston pull him into the game on his terms. That was about to change. Ray's words stuck with Eli long after the beer turned warm and the porch grew cold. You bleed him slow. It wasn't vengeance. Not really. It was a shift, a change in rhythm. If Langston wanted to use the system to keep others quiet, Eli would use that same system to expose the rot beneath his spotless porch and starched shirts. The first move was subtle. Eli filed a public records request with the town zoning office. It wasn't hard, just a few online forms, and a 3-day wait. When the envelope arrived, Eli sat at the kitchen table and flipped through over a decade of permits tied to 141 Maple Lane. That's when he found them. 2 home additions, one marked pending inspection, but never signed off. A fence extension without approval, a retaining wall listed under a different contractor's license, and the biggest one, a patio expansion that pushed right up to the easement line. That was the one Eli flagged. He submitted an anonymous tip to the township office, then another about the unregistered contractor, then a third about the fence. Next, he joined a local Facebook group, one for contractors, homeowners, and code enforcement workers in the county. It was mostly filled with debates over siding materials and deck stain recommendations. But Eli knew how to ask the right questions. Curious, he wrote, how far from the property line can a patio legally extend in Marlow Glen Asking, because a neighbor's build is about 6 feet over where mine ends? He attached a photo, not Langston's house directly, but one close enough for anyone familiar with the neighborhood to recognize the stonework. a local inspector chimed in 2 days later. Anything over 3 feet, without a variance, is a code issue, especially near a drainage slope. That's when the city got involved. 2 inspectors arrived the following week. They parked across the street in an unmarked sedan, clipboards in hand. Eli watched them stroll down Langston's walkway. Knock then spend 30 minutes measuring his fence porch patio and side yard. Langston followed them like a man being audited, red-faced, gesturing wildly. But the inspectors didn't flinch. One took photos. The other made a call. The first fine hit 4 days later. One learned $200 for the patio encroachment. The second came a week after $800 for failure to update contractor documentation. The fence extension, under review. And suddenly, the man who'd built a kingdom out of silence and intimidation was drowning in paperwork and phone calls. Eli didn't stop there. He found another clause in the HOA bylaws about downspout redirection. Langston's gutters dumped runoff onto the sidewalk, causing algae and ice in the winter. That was a violation too, another anonymous tip. Then a neighbor 2 doors down casually mentioned in the Facebook group that she'd seen standing water near Langston's retaining wall. Could be erosion, she said innocently. Eli didn't ask her to post it, but he didn't have to. The neighborhood had started to wake up, and people were tired of walking on eggshells. Langston tried to fight back. He filed more complaints about the chalk drawings the Treehouse light, which stayed off but still existed the backyard music. But none of them stuck. The HOA board, once quietly intimidated by his lawyerly language and constant threats, now saw him for what he was, a bully in decline. Then one morning, Eli saw something new. Langston standing in the middle of his yard phone in hand, just staring, not pacing, not ranting, just staring across the street at the Jeffersons' house, where their grandkids were stringing up paper lanterns. The porch stank again, even after the boards had been replaced, even after the plastic was torn down, and the insulation swapped out. The scent clung to the subflooring. Like mildew and rot had rooted into the bones of the house. Mary left soon after. Eli didn't see the argument, but he heard it. A door slammed, followed by the unmistakable crunch of tires rolling over gravel. Her SUV was packed to the brim. She didn't look back as she drove off. Langston didn't chase her. He just stood there watching the car disappear down Maple Lane. His pressed shirt now wrinkled his hair unkempt. Something inside him had cracked, and for once, Eli didn't feel satisfaction. Just emptiness. He sat on the treehouse deck that evening, watching the sunset glow behind the old elm. Milo climbed up beside him, flashlight in one hand and a peanut butter sandwich in the other. He didn't say anything at first, just passed half the sandwich to his dad. Eli took it. They sat in silence for a while, legs swinging over the edge. "Do you think he'll leave?" Milo asked finally. Eli didn't answer right away. "I think people like him don't know how to live in a place where they don't scare everyone," he said. "So, maybe." Milo nodded, chewing thoughtfully. "Good." And in that moment, as the sky faded to navy and the stars blinked into view, Eli realized something important. The real victory wasn't in fines or citations. It was that for the first time in a long while, people weren't afraid anymore. Not even the kids. The for sale sign appeared on Langston's lawn 3 days after Mary left. No announcement. No goodbye. Just a crisp, white sign stabbed into the soil like a surrender flag. It listed the house with a local agency, one known for flipping difficult properties fast. Eli saw the van show up before sunrise movers, unloading crates, packing tape, crackling in the cold morning air. Langston didn't help. He hovered. He paced up and down his porch in his signature pressed shirt, and loafers barking instructions, with the clipped tone of a man trying to hold onto something, already slipping through his fingers. His hair was still neatly parted, but the color in his face had drained, leaving him looking smaller, almost sunken. No neighbors came to wave him off. No one brought coffee or asked where he was going. Even the dog walkers crossed to the other side of the street without saying a word. The man who once ran the block like a private fiefdom now stood in a moat of silence. Eli watched from the treehouse. He and Milo sat side by side, legs dangling off the edge. The morning was cool breeze rustling through the elm leaves, but the sun was starting to climb. The moving truck engine rumbled as two workers lifted a heavy credenza down the front steps. Langston hovered nearby, snapping at them to watch the corners. Even though they moved with professional ease, Milo leaned his head against Eli's shoulder. Is he leaving because of us? Eli hesitated. He'd been dreading that question. Not exactly, he said after a pause. He's leaving because people stopped letting him treat them that way. He didn't know how to handle it. Milo nodded slowly, as if chewing on the idea. Good, he murmured. I didn't like him. Eli chuckled softly. Yeah, me neither. Down below, Langston scolded one of the movers for placing a box too close to a flower bed. The worker shrugged and kept going. There was no malice in their movements, just detachment, the kind that came with too many years moving people like Langston in and out of houses they couldn't command anymore. By noon, the truck was nearly full. Langston stood alone on the driveway, clipboard in hand, shouting into a cell phone. Eli didn't care what he was saying. It didn't matter anymore. The neighborhood was already different. Kids played freely on the sidewalks again. No more measured laughter. No more hushed warnings. The Jeffersons had started planting a vegetable garden in their backyard, letting the grandkids dig trenches with their tiny shovels. The Clarks hosted weekend movie nights, with a projector draped across their garage door. Someone even organized a potluck. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, alive. Ray joined Eli and Milo just as the truck pulled away. He climbed the ladder slower these days, his knees not what they once were, but he made it up without complaint. He handed Eli a cold beer, then leaned against the far wall, taking in the scene below with a long, weathered breath. So he said, "You win." Eli took the beer, popped the cap, and stared down at the empty driveway across the street. "Doesn't feel like winning," he said. Ray nodded. "Yeah, that's the thing about justice. It gives you peace, not celebration." They sat in silence for a while. Just the wind and the rustle of leaves above their heads. Milo began sketching in a notebook, resting it on his knees. He was drawing the treehouse, its sharp angles and fresh paint. A tiny Milo waving from the top window. Below it, he drew stick figures, Ray, Eli, the neighbors, all smiling. Eli glanced over and smiled, the corners of his mouth soft, but genuine. "You know," he said to Ray, "when we first built this, I thought it was just a place for Milo to play, but it became something else." Ray nodded slowly. It became something to fight for. Eli looked back out at the neighborhood. The late afternoon sun was stretching long shadows across the lawns. Dogs barked, someone's wind chime sang. No more eyes peeking from behind curtains. No more threats on paper. Just people finally being people again. "I don't think Milo will remember," Langston, Eli said after a while. "Not the way we do. I think he'll remember this, the treehouse, the lights, the laughter." Ray smiled, lifting his beer in a quiet toast. Then we did all right. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of blooming lilacs. Not from Langston's yard, but from June, Jefferson's new bushes planted in defiance just weeks before. They smelled fresh, honest. Eli leaned back against the wooden wall, feeling its strength behind him. He looked at Milo legs swinging, pencil scribbling, and realized that despite everything there was still joy here. Still hope. It didn't erase the damage, the silence, the weight of every sleepless night. But it was a beginning. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough.